Under the brilliant biting sun of Big Sky, Montana, former SEAL Silas Thorne believed he'd left the battlefield behind, but his combat canine Coda just caught a scent that doesn't belong in this peaceful world. When a fragile old man is cornered by a ruthless predator, a dead soldier's watch begins to tick once more, signaling a war that transcends the boundaries of the living and the dead. From silent midnight infiltrations to a high-stakes pincer maneuver in the freezing mist of a mineral mine, Silas and his loyal shadow must protect a legacy written in blood, gears, and ancient promises. Coda isn't just a dog. He's a spiritual sentinel who sees the ghost Silas tries to forget, guiding them through a lethal web of corruption that runs deeper thaw the mountain roots. The hunters have officially become the hunted as the Alpha Formation locks in, and the snowy peaks are about to bear witness to a brand of justice that is as absolute as the winter frost. But the most shocking truth isn't who's attacking them, it's the miraculous presence that has been guarding them from the shadows all along. Stay with us, because what Silas finds at the mountain's peak is a moment that will haunt your heart and redefine everything you know about loyalty and fate. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. If this story of courage and animal instinct moves you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these legends alive. The sun over Big Sky, Montana, was a deceptive coin of gold tossed into a frozen blue sky, offering brilliant light but no warmth to the jagged peaks that cradled the valley. Silas Thorne stood by the window of his weathered timber cabin, his breath fogging the glass as he adjusted the focus on his Steiner binoculars. At 40, Silas carried the rugged, architectural build of a man who had been forged in the high-stress environments of Tier 1 special operations. His frame was a map of dense muscle and old, silvered scars, his jawline as sharp and unforgiving as the granite cliffs of the Gallatin Range. His face was etched with the quiet, weary stoicism of a former SEAL commander who had seen the world break in ways most people couldn't imagine. His salt and pepper hair cut into a utilitarian buzz that matched his disciplined, solitary lifestyle. Beside him, Coda, a 5-year-old solid black German shepherd, sat in a perfect, motionless statue position. Coda was not a typical pet. He was a 90-pound shadow of pure muscle, a retired multi-purpose canine, MPC, who had shared the same dust and blood as Silas in the Hindu Kush. His fur was as dark as a moonless night, save for the intelligent, amber eyes that seemed to vibrate with a constant, calculated assessment of his surroundings. Together, they were two ghosts of a forgotten war, living in a self-imposed exile, bound by a trauma that Silas had yet to name. For 30 days, Silas's morning ritual had remained unchanged. He watched Elias Vance through the long-range optics. He observed the 75-year-old man shuffle across his porch, his silver hair catching the morning light like spun silk. Elias was the father of Logan Vance, the man who had taken a bullet meant for Silas 3 years ago. Silas lived with the crushing, silent debt of the survivor, a guilt that kept him at a distance, hovering like a guardian angel who believed himself a demon. He knew Elias's routine, the way his arthritic hands, stained with the fine oils of a master watchmaker, fumbled with the mail, and the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of a loneliness that mirrored Silas's own. Silas didn't want to be seen. He wanted to ensure the old man was safe, a final mission to honor a dead brother. Eventually, Silas lowered the binoculars, signaled to Coda with a subtle snap of his fingers, and began his own descent into the town, knowing that today, the distance he had maintained was about to vanish. The Gallatin Valley Grocer was a hub of artificial warmth, smelling of roasted coffee and floor wax, a stark contrast to the biting 10-degree air outside. Silas moved through the aisles with a predator's economy of motion, his pale blue eyes cold as glacial ice scanning the exits and the patrons without conscious effort. He wore a faded Carhartt jacket that concealed his broad shoulders, trying to blend into the local scenery of ranchers and tourists. But Koda's presence made him undeniable. The dog moved at a heel, so precise it was as if he were tethered to Silas's thigh, his ears swiveling to track every rustle of a plastic bag. They reached the checkout line just as Elias Vance was fumbling with his tattered leather wallet. The cashier, a harried teenager with neon-dyed hair and a look of permanent exhaustion, tapped her fingernails on the counter as Elias counted out a meager pile of crumpled ones and a scattering of copper coins. He was $12 short for a simple basket of eggs, bread, and a small tin of high-quality clock oil. Behind Elias stood Caleb Sterling, a man in his late 20s whose presence felt like a smudge of grease on a clean window. Caleb was the nephew of the town's local land king, Vance Sterling, and he carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a man who used his last name as a shield. He was dressed in an expensive, bright red North Face parka that looked too new for Montana, his face flushed from the cold and an obvious early morning nip of whiskey. His features were soft and entitled, his eyes narrowed with the petty impatience of someone who had never known a day of real hardship. "Come on, old man," Caleb sneered, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the store like a serrated blade. "If you can't pay, put the stuff back. Some of us have actual lives to get to. You're holding up the line with your pocket change." Elias froze, his thin shoulders tensing, a deep flush of shame creeping up his neck as he stared down at the counter, unable to find the words to defend his dignity. In that moment of heavy silence, Koda did something that stopped the air in Silas's lungs. The dog didn't growl or snap. Instead, he stepped forward and pressed his cold nose directly into Elias's trembling palm. Then, Koda tilted his head upward, looking into the empty space just behind the old man's shoulder, his amber eyes widening as if tracking a person Silas couldn't see. He let out a low melodic whine, a sound Silas had only heard him make once before on the night Logan Vance had died. It was a sound of recognition, of a bridge being crossed between the living and the dead. Silas felt a jolt of electricity race down his spine, a primal instinct screaming that this wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a summons. The atmosphere in the store shifted, the fluorescent lights seeming to flicker with a sudden localized pressure, as if a third, invisible party had just stepped into the queue to watch over the watchmaker. Silas broke the spell by stepping forward, his heavy tactical boots thudding softly on the linoleum. He didn't look at Caleb, but the sheer physical gravity of his presence caused the younger man to instinctively take a half step back. Silas reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and laid it firmly on the counter over Elias's coins. "The man is checking out," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried the absolute authority of a commanding officer. "And you," he shifted his glacial gaze to Caleb, the intensity of his stare enough to make the air feel thin, "are going to wait your turn in silence." Caleb opened his mouth to retort, but he caught the look in Silas's eyes, the look of a man who had looked into the abyss and didn't blink, and the words died in his throat. Caleb's face turned a darker shade of red, his ego bruised, but he stayed quiet, his eyes darting toward the window where a black SUV with tinted windows sat idling in the lot. Elias turned, his clouded blue eyes searching Silas's face with a mixture of confusion and a flickering, haunting sense of familiarity. I don't know how to thank you, son," Elias whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. Silas merely nodded, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. He watched as Elias gathered his small bag of groceries and walked toward the automatic doors, his gait slightly more stable than it had been minutes before. Silas lingered for a moment, his hand resting on Koda's head, feeling the dog's steady, powerful heartbeat. He looked out the window as Elias climbed into his rusted Ford F-150, but his focus was on the black SUV that began to crawl slowly behind the old man's truck. The ghosting phase of Silas's mission was over. The predator was at the gate, and Silas Thorne, along with the shadow at his side, was no longer just a witness. The debt was being called in, and the cold Montana air was about to taste like iron. The black SUV lingered like a predatory shark in the wake of Elias Vance's battered Ford F-150 as they wound their way out of the town center and toward the more secluded outskirts of Big Sky. Silas Thorne followed at a disciplined distance, his silver Toyota Tundra blending into the landscape of salt-grimed trucks and winter-beaten vehicles common to the Montana highlands. Inside the cab, the air was silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the heater and the steady breathing of Coda, who sat in the passenger seat with his head level, eyes tracking the black vehicle ahead with a focus that bordered on the supernatural. Silas gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the dark leather. His mind was a chaotic theater of tactical assessments and visceral memories of Logan Vance's final moments in a dusty alleyway half a world away. He could still feel the phantom weight of Logan's blood on his gloves, a stain that no amount of Montana snow could ever scrub clean. Every time Silas glanced at the back of Elias's head through the truck's rear window, he saw the ghost of his friend, the same stubborn set of the ears, the same slight tilt of the neck. Silas wasn't just protecting an old man. He was guarding the only living piece of his own shattered soul. The black SUV eventually peeled away at a fork in the road, but Silas didn't relax. He knew the brake contact maneuver was likely a ruse or a sign that the trackers had already gathered the intelligence they needed. He waited until Elias pulled into a long, winding gravel driveway flanked by towering ponderosa pines before he slowed his own vehicle, his heart hammering a heavy, tactical rhythm against his ribs. Elias Vance's home was a sprawling two-story cabin made of dark-stained cedar and river stone, a structure that looked as though it had grown directly out of the mountainside. It was a place of shadows and craftsmanship. The porch, cluttered with old clock casings and the skeletal remains of mechanical projects. As Silas pulled up behind the Ford, Coda's behavior shifted instantly. The dog didn't wait for a command to exit. His body became a coiled spring of tension, his hackles rising in a thin, jagged line along his spine. When Silas opened the door, Coda didn't bound toward the house. Instead, he moved with a slow, deliberate low crawl toward the rear of Elias's truck. The German shepherd's nose worked frantically, his breath coming in short, sharp puffs of steam in the freezing air. Silas watched, his hand hovering near the concealed Glock at his hip as Coda went stiff, his tail curling into a rigid U, shaped the signal for a foreign object. Silas knelt beside the dog, his fingers searching the underside of the wheel well until they brushed against a small, plastic-encased rectangle magnetically attached to the frame. It was a high-end GPS tracker, the kind used by private security firms or professional debt collectors. Silas felt a cold, familiar rage settle in his gut. They weren't just bullying Elias at the grocery store. They were hunting him. He pocketed the device, his jaw set in an iron line, and signaled Coda to follow him as Elias stepped out onto his porch, looking smaller and more fragile against the backdrop of the vast, indifferent mountains. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of aged cedar, lemon, oil, and the metallic tang of clockwork. It was a living museum of time. Hundreds of clocks lined the walls, cuckoos, grandfathers, delicate mantle pieces all ticking in a disjointed, chaotic symphony that seemed to pulse through the floorboards. Elias stood in the center of the kitchen, his hands trembling as he unpacked his meager groceries. The sound of the ticking clocks, seemingly the only thing keeping him upright. Silas moved through the space with the silent, invasive grace of a house clearer, his eyes scanning for any sign of a breach. Coda, however, did not settle. He moved to the threshold of the living room and stopped dead, his ears swiveling forward and his body angling toward the darkened hallway that led to the bedrooms. He didn't growl, but a low, subterranean vibration started in his chest, a sound that Silas recognized as threat localizing. Silas signaled for Elias to stay quiet, his own movements becoming a shadow as he followed Coda's lead. As they reached the mouth of the hallway, Coda suddenly sat down and stared intensely at a closed wooden door, but he didn't look at the handle or the floor. His gaze was fixed upward, at a point exactly 6 feet off the ground, his amber eyes tracking something invisible that seemed to be moving slowly toward them. The chaotic ticking of the clocks in the house abruptly fell into a perfect, terrifying unison, a single deafening thump-talk that echoed Logan's own heartbeat in Silas's memory. Coda let out a soft combat huff, his tail wagging once tentatively, as if he were greeting a friend he hadn't seen in years. A sudden, unexplained warmth washed over Silas's shoulder, the distinct sensation of a heavy hand resting there in a gesture of brotherhood, just as it had been 1,000 times on the battlefield. For 3 seconds, the air in the hallway tasted not of Montana pine, but of the ozone and cordite of a distant war zone, and Silas felt a profound, bone-deep certainty that he wasn't the only soldier in the room. The moment shattered when the sound of a shotgun slide racking echoed from the darkness of the doorway Coda had been watching. "Step back into the light right now, or I swear I'll put a hole in you that the mountain won't be able to fill." A woman's voice commanded, sharp, steady, and filtered through a layer of pure, protective adrenaline. Silas raised his hands slowly, palms open, as Elena Vance stepped into the hallway. At 28, Elena was a striking mirror of her brother Logan. She had the same piercing hazel eyes that seemed to hold a permanent, restless fire, and the same athletic, lean build of someone who spent her days on her feet. She was dressed in dark blue nurse's scrubs, her chestnut hair pulled back into a messy, functional knot, but the Remington 870 in her grip was held with the practiced ease of a local who knew how to defend her own. Her skin was pale and dusted with a few light freckles across a nose that was slightly upturned, giving her a look of fierce defiance. She looked exhausted, the dark circles under her eyes speaking of long shifts at the hospital and the crushing stress of watching her grandfather wither away under Sterling's pressure. But her aim did not waver. She was the town's Waita, a healer by trade. But at this moment, she was the last line of defense for the Vance bloodline. "Elena, wait. He's the man from the store. He helped me," Elias called out from the kitchen, his voice frantic. Elena's eyes didn't leave Silas's. She measured him with a clinical, cold precision, taking in his tactical stance and the way he didn't flinch at the barrel of the gun. She saw the scars on his knuckles and the 1,000-yard stare that marked him as something other than a civilian. "I don't care who he is, Grandpa. People don't just help for nothing in this town anymore," she spat, her finger tightening slightly on the trigger. The tension in the hallway was a physical weight, a hair trigger away from disaster, until Coda broke the stalemate. The massive black dog, who would normally have neutralized a person pointing a weapon at his handler, did something entirely uncharacteristic. He broke his stay command, walked calmly over to Elena, and sat down at her feet. He looked up at her with a soft, mournful expression, and gently rested his heavy head against her knee, his tail thumping twice against the floorboards in a rhythmic, peaceful cadence. Elena's breath hitched in her throat, her grip on the shotgun loosening just a fraction as she looked down at the dog. She recognized that specific, unwavering loyalty. It was the same way Logan's old hunting dog used to look at her. The primal, protective wall she had built around herself seemed to crack as Coda whined softly, a sound of pure cross-species empathy. Silas stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on Elena's, seeing the ghost of Logan's courage in the set of her jaw. "He knows you, Elena," Silas said softly, his voice echoing the solemnity of a prayer. "He knows the blood you carry." The shotgun lowered, the barrel clicking against the floor as Elena's shoulders finally slumped, the fight draining out of her to be replaced by a weary, suspicious curiosity. She looked from the dog to Silas, her hazel eyes searching for an answer to a question she hadn't yet asked. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out the GPS tracker he had found, holding it out for her to see. "There. Tag and tracing him. This isn't about a grocery bill. This is an escalation." The silence that followed was broken only by the synchronized ticking of the clocks, marking the seconds of a peace that Silas knew was only temporary. The hunt had moved from the streets to the home, and as Silas looked at Elena and the fragile old man behind her, he knew the silence of the canine had ended. The war for Big Sky had just begun. The heavy iron barrel of the Remington 870 finally tilted toward the floor, the metallic click of the safety being engaged, sounding like a gavel in the unnatural stillness of the hallway. Elena Vance leaned against the cedar paneling, her face a mask of exhausted disbelief as she stared at the GPS tracker in Silas's open palm. The house, which had moments ago felt like a fortress under siege, now felt like a tomb, heavy with the weight of unanswered questions and the relentless ticking of 100 clocks. Silas watched her carefully, his tactical mind cataloging the way her hands still shook, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of a woman who had been fighting a losing battle for too long. He signaled Coda to settle, and the great black dog moved to the center of the living room, lying down with his chin on his paws, though his amber eyes remained fixed on the front door. Silas moved slowly toward the kitchen table, his presence still commanding, yet stripped of its immediate lethality. "My name is Silas Thorne," he began, his voice a low, steady hum that seemed to ground the frantic energy of the room. "I served with Logan in the 2nd Development Group. I was his commanding officer, and I was there the night we lost him in the Cuner province." The air seemed to leave Elena in a sharp, jagged gasp, and even Elias, who had been hovering near the stove, went perfectly still, his weathered face crumbling into a map of grief. Silas reached into the inner pocket of his Carhartt jacket and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope, its edges softened by years of being carried close to his heart. The wax seal had been broken long ago, but the paper inside was pristine. "Logan didn't die because of a mistake," Silas said, his gaze locking onto Elena's with an intensity that demanded she listen. "He died because he stepped into the line of fire to shield me while I was calling in an extraction for our wounded. He made a choice based on a promise we all made to each other. He told me that if anything happened, I had to find you. He said his father had a heart of gold and a mind of gears, and his sister had the fire of the mountains. He made me swear I'd look out for the Vance name." Elena sank into a wooden chair, the shotgun leaning against the table as she stared at the letter. Silas didn't hand it to her yet. He knew the weight of Logan's words would be a burden she wasn't ready to carry while Sterling's shadow was still over the house. I've been in Big Sky for a month, Silas confessed, the admission tasting like ash. I stayed in the woods because I didn't know how to look you in the eye after I came home, and he didn't. But seeing that tracker, seeing what happened at the grocer, the time for watching is over. Vance Sterling isn't just looking for a debt payment, is he? Elias took a seat opposite his granddaughter, his arthritic fingers intertwining. The old man looked up at Silas, his pale blue eyes reflecting a sudden, sharp clarity. No, Commander, Elias said, the title coming naturally to him as if he recognized the authority Silas carried. Sterling wants the land. This cabin sits directly above the deep rock aquifer. It's the purest mineral water in the state, untouched by the mining runoff from the north. He's already bought up the surrounding 300 acres under various shell companies. We're the last piece of the puzzle. He needs this property to secure the water rights for a luxury resort project that's worth 10 times what this town is. He's been squeezing us, using Caleb to provoke us, hiking up to interest on a small bridge loan I took out after Logan's funeral when the hospital bills for Elena's mother piled up. It's a hostile takeover, disguised as a collection. As Elias spoke of the land and the legacy, Coda suddenly stood up, his ears twitching as he walked over to an old, dust-covered roll-top desk. In the corner of the room that had remained untouched for years, the dog pawed gently at a specific drawer, a heavy oak compartment that was locked tight. Silas frowned, knowing Coda's alert behaviors were never random. As Silas approached the desk, the hundreds of clocks in the room suddenly ceased their disjointed ticking, falling into a vacuum of absolute silence that made Silas's ears ring. In that void, a single, rhythmic tink-tink began to emanate from inside the locked drawer. Coda let out a sharp, joyful bark, spinning in a circle before sitting back down and pointing his nose at the wood. Silas looked at Elias, who had gone pale. "That's Logan's watch," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "The one I made for him when he graduated Bud S. It hasn't worked since the day he was killed. I've tried to fix it a dozen times, but the mainspring was shattered beyond repair." Silas reached out and pulled the drawer. Surprisingly, it glided open as if the wood had been oiled seconds ago. Resting on a velvet cushion was a heavy, tactical-grade timepiece with a bronze casing and a leather strap. The second hand wasn't just moving. It was sweeping with a fluid, haunting precision, and as Silas touched the glass, a faint golden light seemed to pulse from the dial, illuminating the room with a warmth that felt like a physical embrace. Coda let out a low, satisfied huff, his eyes reflecting the glow as if he were seeing his old friend standing right there by the desk, guiding Silas's hand toward the truth. The silence of the other clocks remained, a respectful pause as if the house itself was acknowledging a superior force. Elena walked over, her fingers brushing the glass of the watch, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "He's still here," she breathed, her voice a fragile thread of hope. Silas felt the familiar cold steel of his resolve harden into something unbreakable. He looked at the watch, then at the GPS tracker on the table, and finally at the black SUV he knew was lurking somewhere in the dark pines outside. "Logan's watch is telling us something, Elena," Silas said, his voice dropping into a combat-ready tone. "Time is running out for Sterling. He thinks he's dealing with a grieving old man and a tired nurse. He doesn't know he just triggered a quick reaction. Force." Silas turned to Elias, his eyes narrowing as he began to formulate a plan that involved more than just physical defense. "I need to know everything about Sterling's operations. Every name, every property, every local official he has in his pocket. If this is a war for water and land, we aren't going to just sit here and wait for them to knock. We're going to take the fight to his doorstep. Silas's mind was already racing, recalling the descriptions of Vance Sterling he had gathered during his month of reconnaissance. Sterling was a 55-year-old predator with silver hair and a charismatic smile that hid a soul of pure ice. He was a man who enjoyed the finer things in life: expensive Scotch, Italian suits, and the thrill of breaking people's wills. He was protected by a layer of legal immunity and local corruption, but Silas knew that every system had a weak point. He looked at Elena, seeing her strength returning, as she gripped the shotgun again, this time with a different kind of purpose. "We need to call in some favors," Silas said, looking at the tactical watch that continued its impossible rhythmic sweep. "I have people who owe Logan their lives, experts in Trinsat and signal intelligence. If Sterling wants to play at being a warlord in Montana, we're going to show him what a real insurgency looks like." Toda stood up and moved to the front window, his body blocking the light as he stared out into the gathering gloom of the Montana evening. The black dog's amber eyes caught the fading sun, glowing like embers. He let out a single deep bark, a declaration of war that echoed through the valley, signaling that the testament of Logan was no longer a letter of mourning, but a blueprint for justice. Silas Thorne stood in the center of the room, the commander once more, knowing that by sunrise, the hunters would become the hunted. The transition from protector to predator was a silent, internal shift that Silas Thorne executed with the chilling precision of a master dial-turner. It began when Elena returned from her double shift at the St. Jude's Community Hospital, her face stripped of color and her hands trembling so violently she couldn't even hold her car keys. She recounted how Vance Sterling had appeared at the nurse's station, a silver-haired specter of refined malice who had leaned over her desk with a smile that didn't reach his reptilian gray eyes. Vance Sterling was a study in practiced elegance. At 55, he maintained a lean, equestrian build, his skin tanned to a deep bronze and stretched tight over high, aristocratic cheekbones that suggested a lineage of ruthless conquerors. He was dressed in a charcoal gray bespoke suit that cost more than Elena's annual salary, smelling of expensive sandalwood and the cold, sterile air of a boardroom. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply remarked on how unpredictable the mountain winter could be for elderly men living alone in old wooden cabins, and how tragic a localized fire would be for the town's history. Silas listened to her report while cleaning his tactical gear, his expression as unreadable as a slab of basalt. But Coda, lying at his feet, had let out a low, guttural vibration that rattled the floorboards, his ears pinned back in a display of primal protective instinct. Silas knew Sterling's move was a classic, opening gambit in a war of nerves, a psychological probe designed to incite panic. But Silas Thorne didn't panic. He retaliated. Under the shroud of a moonless Montana night, Silas and Coda moved toward the Eyrie, Sterling's glass and steel mansion perched precariously on a ridge overlooking the valley. Silas was a shadow among shadows, dressed in a matte black tactical suit that broke up his formidable silhouette, his movements fluid and devoid of sound. Beside him, Coda had entered ghost mode, the 5-year-old German shepherd moving with a supernatural grace, his black fur absorbing what little light remained. This wasn't a mission of destruction, but of infiltration, a surgical strike into the enemy's sanctuary to prove that walls were merely an illusion. Silas used a high-frequency jammer to bypass the perimeter cameras, while Coda used his specialized training to navigate the sophisticated laser tripwire grid in the garden. The dog moved with a dancer's precision, weaving through the invisible infrared beams as if he could see the heat itself, his nose occasionally twitching to catalog the scent of the two guards patrolling the east wing. One of the guards, a man named Millera, a thick-necked brute with a buzz cut and a jagged scar running from his ear to his chin, passed within 3 feet of them, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. Silas pressed himself against a stone pillar, his hand resting on Coda's flank. He could feel the dog's heart beating in a slow, steady combat rest rhythm, a testament to their years of shared danger. They reached the master suite on the 2nd floor, sliding through a balcony door Silas had silently picked. As Silas began to plant the surveillance devices, Coda suddenly stopped in the center of Sterling's opulent, white-carpeted bedroom. The dog didn't look at the sleeping man or the expensive art. He walked straight to a hidden wall safe concealed behind a portrait of Sterling himself. Coda sat down and let out a soft, rhythmic tapping with his tail against the floor. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. It was the triple tap signal Logan used to use to tease Silas during training. Silas's breath hitched as he approached the safe. Without a stethoscope or a drill, he placed his ear to the cold steel, and for a fleeting second, he heard a faint, melodic chiming from within, the exact same harmonic frequency as Logan's tactical watch. Coda looked up at Silas, his amber eyes glowing with an eerie, knowing light in the dark, and for a moment, Silas felt a warm, invisible pressure on his wrist, as if a ghostly hand were guiding his fingers to the dial. The safe didn't open, but Silas felt a surge of profound spiritual certainty that the evidence they needed was locked inside, protected by a force that Sterling could never comprehend. Silas shook off the chill of the supernatural and returned to the task at hand. He moved to Sterling's bedside table with the silent efficiency of a wraith. He didn't touch the man, though it would have been easy to end the war right there. Instead, Silas reached into his pouch and withdrew a challenge coin, a heavy bronze medallion bearing the scorched emblem of their SEAL team, the same one Logan had carried in his pocket the day he died. He placed the coin directly onto Sterling's silk pillow, just inches from the man's ear. Next to it, he laid a small black digital recorder. With a final, lingering look at the man who thought he owned the mountain, Silas signaled Coda. They vanished back into the night as silently as they had arrived, leaving no footprints in the frost, no tripped alarms, and no broken glass. An hour later, as Silas stood on the porch of the Vance cabin, he pressed a button on his remote detonator, not for an explosive, but for the recorder he had left behind. In the distance, high up on the ridge, he imagined Sterling waking up to the sound of his own voice. The recording wasn't of Sterling's private conversations. It was a loop of the last 30 seconds of Logan Vance's life, the sound of the Montana wind, the rhythmic ticking of a watch, and Silas's own voice whispering, "I'm coming for you." It was a message that transcended distance and time. Silas stood in the cold, feeling Coda press against his leg, the dog's gaze fixed on the lights of the mansion. The psychological warfare had begun, and Silas had just stripped Sterling of his most valuable asset, the feeling of being safe. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, Silas knew that Sterling would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering how a dead man's dog had walked through his dreams. The warning was delivered. The commander was here, the shadow was watching, and the debt was about to be paid in full. The psychological blow Silas dealt to Vance Sterling rippled through the valley, like an incoming storm front, turning the billionaire's refined arrogance into a frantic, jagged desperation. By noon the following day, Silas watched through his long-range optics as a convoy of 3 dark-armored SUVs climbed the winding road towards Sterling's estate. This wasn't local muscle, but the Vultures, a high-priced private security firm comprised of disgraced ex-military contractors who specialized in asset protection through intimidation and violence. Leading them was Gideon Voss, a man Silas remembered from a joint operation in Djibouti. Voss was a hulking, predatory figure in his mid-40s, with a neck as thick as an oak stump and a face that looked as though it had been carved from cracked leather. He was a man devoid of a moral compass, his personality defined by a cool, transactional efficiency that had earned him a dishonorable discharge. Silas knew that the game had changed. Sterling had stopped trying to scare a watchmaker and had begun preparing for an insurgency. Silas stood on the porch of the Vance cabin, the cold Montana wind whipping at his jacket, and realized he could no longer hold the line alone. He reached into his pocket and activated a burner phone, sending a single encrypted burst. Alpha 1-1. The debt is due. Big Sky. The response was faster than a heartbeat. Within 6 hours, the first of his brothers arrived. Jacques Rook, a Reese pulled into the driveway in a nondescript, mud-caked delivery van that hummed with the hidden power of 1,000 servers. At 38, Rook was a man who lived in the frequencies between data packets, his lean, wiry frame possessing a nervous, kinetic energy that contrasted sharply with Silas's mountain-like stillness. His skin was the color of parchment from years spent behind high-resolution monitors, and his left hand was a marvel of tragedy and technology, missing 2 fingers from an IED in Fallujah. They had been replaced by matte black carbon fiber prosthetics that moved with an uncanny, silent fluidity. Rook was brilliant, cynical, and possessed a razor-sharp gallows humor that had kept their team sane during the darkest nights in the Hindu Kush. He stepped out of the van, eyes already scanning the horizon for signal towers, and nodded once to Silas. No embrace was needed. The brotherhood was a constant, unspoken weight. Before the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, the second shadow emerged from the tree line. Cashin. Ghost Vane didn't arrive so much as he materialized, a pillar of lean, 6'4" muscle that seemed to absorb the fading light. Ghost was the team's long-range specialist, a man of haunting, ethereal silence whose face was bisected by a jagged white scar running from his left eyebrow to his jaw, reminder of the shrapnel that had nearly taken his life. He was a man of 0 words, his character defined by a predatory stillness and a loyalty that was more religious than professional. He carried a heavy, waterproof Pelican case as if it weighed nothing, his pale eyes void of emotion meeting Silas's in a silent oath of lethality. Inside the cabin's workshop, as Rook began to deploy a grid of tactical micro-drones, Coda suddenly stood up and walked to a corner of the room where Logan's old, battered deployment footlocker sat. The dog didn't paw at the lid. Instead, he began to nudge a specific rusted rivet on the side of the metal box with the tip of his nose, breathing in a rhythmic triple huff pattern. Rook stopped what he was doing, his carbon fiber fingers frozen over his keyboard. "Silas, that's Logan's old crypto rhythm," Rook whispered, his voice trembling with a rare note of awe. As Coda continued the pattern, the footlocker emitted a soft pneumatic hiss. A hidden compartment Silas never knew existed slid open from the false bottom. Inside lay a single, encrypted, satellite uplink and a handwritten note in Logan's jagged script that simply read, "For when the commander needs his eyes back." Coda let out a soft, soulful whine, his amber eyes reflecting a strange golden glint from the device, and, for a fleeting second, the hundreds of clocks in the room skipped a beat in perfect unison, as if time itself were bowing to a man who had planned for this war from beyond the grave. The atmosphere in the room shifted from a desperate defense to an organized strike. Ghost, moving with the grace of a phantom, began to set up a nest on the second floor, his Macmillan TAC 338 rifle becoming an extension of his body. Rook integrated Logan's gift into his drone network, creating a blackout bubble around the Vance property that would scramble any GPS or cellular signals Sterling's mercenaries tried to use. Silas stood in the center of the kitchen, looking at the tactical map Rook had projected onto the wall. They had created a combat outpost, COP, in the heart of Big Sky. Ghost has the high ground, Silas commanded, his voice reclaiming the steel of a commander. Rook, I want a full-spectrum tap on Sterling's SUVs. If they move, I want to know the tire pressure before they hit the driveway. Silas then turned his attention to Coda. He buckled a specialized tactical harness onto the dog's broad chest. A lightweight, Kevlar weave vest equipped with a high-definition 360-degree camera and a bone conduction radio. Coda stood tall, his black fur glistening under the harness, his tail giving a single powerful thump against Silas's leg. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He was the team's eyes in the shadows, a Trinsat unit that could go where no human could. As the night deepened, the three men and the dog formed a silent, unbreakable circle around Elias and Elena Vance. Elena stood by the hearth, her hazel eyes reflecting the tactical glow of the monitors, seeing the way Silas and his team operated with a terrifying synchronized grace. She realized that while Sterling had hired men for money, Silas had summoned them for a debt of blood. The Alpha formation was complete. Outside, the Montana forest was silent, but Silas knew that Ghost was out there, a wraith in the pines, and that Coda was already patrolling the perimeter, his senses dialed into the frequency of the enemy. Sterling thought he was the apex predator of Big Sky, but Silas Thorne had just reconnected with his pack. As Rook tapped into the first of Sterling's encrypted radios, hearing the confused chatter of the mercenaries who couldn't understand why their tech was failing, Silas looked at the golden watch on his wrist. The one Logan had started from the dead. The seconds were sweeping with a fluid, inevitable precision. The formation wasn't just for protection. It was the foundation for a gun cane maneuver that would squeeze Sterling until his empire turned to dust. The war had entered its second phase, and the Alpha had finally reclaimed the night. The fragile peace of the Vance cabin shattered at 4 p.m. when Elena's hospital pager, left charging on the kitchen counter, began to scream with a frantic, continuous tone that Silas knew was a prearranged distress signal. Rook's monitors immediately flared crimson as he intercepted a frantic cellular burst. From the edge of the town, Elena's car had been forced off the Blackwood grade, and a burner phone left at the scene began to vibrate with a call from Vance. Sterling. The billionaire's voice was no longer refined. It was a jagged, desperate rasp, demanding that Elias bring the signed land deed to the abandoned Deep Rock mineral springs at the base of the Devil's Throat Canyon by sunset, or Elena would be lost to the mountain. Silas didn't waste a second on anger. He moved into a state of cold, hyper-focused lethality. He gathered Rook and Ghost, their movements a synchronized blur of tactical preparation. The Deep Rock Springs was a nightmare of a battlefield, a sprawling network of ancient mining tunnels and steaming thermal vents where the heat of the earth met the killing frost of the Montana winter, creating a permanent, shifting shroud of fog. Sterling hadn't just sent his usual thugs. Rook's drones identified a new player. On the ground, Vic Volkov, a 35-year-old freelance operative and former Spetsnaz specialist who had been hired as Sterling's closer. Vic was a woman of terrifying skeletal beauty, her platinum blonde hair shorn into a brutal undercut and her icy blue eyes possessing the flat, vacant stare of a sociopath. She was lean and whipcord strong, dressed in alpine white tactical gear that made her nearly invisible in the mist, and she carried a suppressed submachine gun with the casual familiarity of a veteran who viewed human life as a mere logistical hurdle. Silas orchestrated a gun-can pincer maneuver that utilized every ounce of his team's specialized training. Ghost ascended the jagged eastern ridge, melting into the gray rocks with his long-range rifle, while Rook stayed back in the van, launching a swarm of Black Hornet micro-drones to map the thermal signatures within the steaming cavern mouth. Silas and Coda took the direct, high-risk approach, navigating the slick, ice-covered boulders of the canyon floor. Coda was equipped with his full tactical harness, his black fur damp with the freezing mist, his nose working overtime to filter the sulfurous stench of the springs from the scent of the enemy. As they neared the entrance of the primary tunnel, where the heat from the mineral water created a thick, white curtain of steam, the tactical radio crackled. "Alpha 1, I have the target," Ghost's voice whispered, as steady as the stone he lay upon. "Vane has the girl." In the central pump room, 3 hostiles on the perimeter. 1 sniper in the old ore crusher tower. Permission to clear the path? Silas gave a sharp single click on his comms. Permission granted. High above, a muffled crack echoed through the canyon, and the mercenary in the tower fell silently into the dark, suddenly veered into the inexplicable. Coda abruptly stopped, his body vibrating with a frequency that Silas felt through the solace of his boots. The dog ignored the thermal signatures Rook was feeding to Silas's HUD. Instead, Coda turned toward a solid wall of jagged limestone where a thin, crystalline sheet of ice had formed over a fissure. Coda began to dig frantically at the ice, his tail thumping against Silas's leg in that strange rhythmic triple tap Logan used to favor. Silas hesitated, his tactical mind shouting to stay on the path, but a sudden, blinding flash of golden light erupted from the tactical watch on his wrist, the one Logan had restarted from the grave. The light reflected off the ice, revealing not just a hidden crawlspace, but a spectral reflection behind Silas's own image. For a heartbeat, Silas saw Logan Vance standing there in full combat gear, his hand pointing directly through the limestone wall toward a lower ventilation shaft that bypassed the mercenaries' ambush. Coda let out a sharp, encouraging bark, and as Silas pressed his ear to the rock, he heard Elena's muffled voice, not from the pump room ahead, but from directly beneath them. The mirage in the steam wasn't a trap. It was a correction. Acting on the spiritual intel, Silas pivoted. While Rook's drones provided a loud, clattering diversion at the main entrance, Silas and Coda slipped into the narrow ventilation shaft. They moved like shadows through the belly of the mountain, the heat from the springs making Silas's tactical suit cling to his skin. Coda led the way, his claws clicking softly on the metal grates until they emerged on a rusted catwalk directly above a subterranean chamber where Vic Volkov was holding Elena. Elena was bound to a heavy iron pipe, her hazel eyes wide with a fierce, silent rage as Vic paced in front of her, checking her watch. 10 minutes, little nurse, Vic rasped, her voice like grinding gravel. Then we stop waiting for your grandfather and start making memories. Silas didn't wait for the timer. He signaled Rook to trigger a high-decibel ultrasonic pulse through the cave's PA system, a sound bomb that disoriented the mercenaries below. In the chaos, Koda launched himself from the catwalk, a 90-pound black blur of fury. The dog didn't just attack. He executed a perfect takedown and hold on the mercenary guarding the door, his teeth sinking into the man's forearm and dragging him into the shadows before a shot could be fired. Silas dropped from the catwalk, landing with a heavy thud behind Vic. She spun, her submachine gun rising, but Silas was faster, his combat knife catching the light as he disarmed her in a blur of hand-to-hand mastery. They collided in a brutal, silent struggle of elite techniques, but Silas's strength, fueled by a month of suppressed grief and the fire of Logan's legacy, was insurmountable. He pinned her against the steaming rock, his forearm across her throat. "The hunt is over," Silas hissed, the coldness in his voice enough to freeze the boiling water at their feet. Outside, the sounds of Rook and Ghost mopping up the remaining vultures signaled the total collapse of Sterling's perimeter. Koda stood over the downed guard, his amber eyes glowing in the dim light, while Silas cut Elena's bonds. She didn't collapse. She grabbed the fallen mercenary's handgun and stood tall, her hazel eyes meeting Silas's with a look of unbreakable steel. They had survived the pincer. Koda had found the truth in stone, and as they emerged from the steaming mouth of the mine into the twilight, Silas saw the black SUV of Vance Sterling idling at the edge of the lot. The predator was cornered, the girl was safe, and the final sweep of the watch's second hand was about to strike the hour of reckoning. The black SUV idling at the edge of the mineral springs didn't stand a chance of escape. Before Vance Sterling could even shift the vehicle into gear, a heavy .338 caliber round from Ghost's rifle shattered the engine block with the force of a falling star, sending a plume of white steam hissed into the freezing air to mingle with the natural vapors of the mountain. Silas Thorne approached the crippled vehicle with the rhythmic, unstoppable gait of a man delivering a final verdict, Koda pacing at his left knee like a living shadow of retribution. Elena followed a few steps behind, the mercenary's handgun held low but ready, her hazel eyes reflecting the cold fire of a woman who had seen her captors broken and her family's legacy defended. As Silas reached the driver's side door and ripped it open, Vance Sterling tumbled out onto the frosted gravel, his charcoal gray suit stained with oil and his aristocratic face twisted into a mask of pathetic, unadulterated terror. He began to stammer about lawyers and land rights, but the words died in his throat as Silas threw a heavy, encrypted data drive onto his chest. The drive Rook had filled with every recorded bribe, every forged signature, and every whispered threat from the safe in the Eyrie. Silas didn't need to pull a trigger to destroy Sterling. He had already dismantled the man's world from the inside out. Into this theater of ruin stepped Detective Sarah Whitaker of the Montana State Bureau of Investigation, who had been waiting in the tree line with CNSAT Trong Miller. At 35, Sarah was a woman of sharp architectural precision. She was tall and lean, her dark brown hair pulled back into a knot so tight it seemed to sharpen her intelligent, observant features. Her skin was pale and weathered by years of high-altitude fieldwork, and she carried a posture of quiet, unshakable authority that made even the mercenaries in the distance sit up straighter. Sarah Whitaker was known for her clinical, dogged pursuit of financial predators, a woman who had lost her own father to a land grab scheme years ago, an event that had turned her soul into a finely honed instrument of legal justice. She looked at the evidence, then at Sterling, and finally at Silas with a look of profound, silent respect. "We'll take it from here, Commander," she said, her voice a steady, cool cadence. "The paper trail you provided is a map to his casket. He won't see the sun from outside his cell for a very long time." The immediate threat was gone, but the mountain held one final mystery for Silas Thorne. 2 days later, as the valley of Big Sky began to heal, under a fresh, gentle blanket of snow, Silas took Coda to the small, windswept cemetery on the ridge overlooking the Vance cabin. They stood before Logan's headstone, the granite cold and silent. Suddenly, Coda's ears pitched forward, and he began to run toward the edge of the cliff, barking a single joyful note that echoed across the peaks. Silas followed, his heart hammering, and stopped dead as he saw Coda standing perfectly still in a patch of impossibly bright sunlight. Beside the dog, the snow seemed to shimmer and swirl into the distinct, translucent shape of a man in combat fatigues, Logan Vance. The apparition didn't speak, but he looked at Silas and gave a sharp, crisp salute, his spectral hand glowing with a warmth that seemed to melt the frost on Silas's own jacket. The tactical watch on Silas's wrist, which had been sweeping perfectly since the night of the springs, suddenly stopped at exactly 11:11, the time of their team's old all-clear signal. Coda let out a soft, soulful whine and wagged his tail once, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving only the scent of ozone and the feeling of a heavy, brotherly hand lifting a weight off Silas's soul that he had carried for 3 long years. Silas stood on the ridge for a long time, the silence of the mountain no longer feeling like a vacuum of grief, but a reservoir of peace. He looked down at the Vance cabin, where smoke was curling warmly from the chimney. Elias was inside, finally at peace, working on the town's great clock with the steady hands of a man who no longer feared the passage of time. Elena was there too, her fire tempered by the knowledge that she was no longer alone in her watch. Silas realized that the mission Logan had given him wasn't just to protect his family. It was to find a reason to come home. He looked at Coda, the 5-year-old German shepherd, looking back with amber eyes that possessed a human-like depth of understanding. The dog had been the bridge, the Lyncium that had guided Silas through the dark, and now, for the first time since the war began, Coda's posture was completely relaxed, his muscles devoid of the combat-ready tension that had defined their lives. Silas walked back down the mountain, his boots crunching in the fresh snow, heading toward the cabin. He didn't pack his gear to leave. Instead, he stopped at the porch and began to stack a fresh cord of wood for the coming winter. Rook and Ghost had moved on to their next debts, but Silas Thorne had found his outpost. He had come to Montana as a ghost seeking a grave, but through the courage of an old man, the fire of a woman, and the inexplicable spirit of a black dog, he had found a life worth living. As the sun set behind the Gallatin Range, painting the sky in hues of violet and gold, the great clock in the town square chimed a single resonant note that echoed through the valley. It was a new hour, a clean slate, and as Silas felt Coda lie down contentedly by his side, he knew that no man gets left behind had finally included himself. The light on the mountain peak wasn't just a signal of victory. It was a beacon for the soul of a warrior who had finally truly found his way home.